Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Republican.
Yes, how you doing?
Good. Hello, sir. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, yes. This is Joey. I'm from Baton Rouge. I was just concerned, and I wanted to get some input from Rachel today on how she thinks that the Bush legacy will be remembered down the road in the future in the history. As you may remember, Lincoln wasn't a very popular president, but he stood up to slavery. Bush is not a very popular president right now, but he's standing up to radical Islam and the morals that this country is built on it. And I'm just not quite sure on who the who the Democrats and some of the liberal radio shows and the pundits, CNN, C-SPAN, CBS, who they're actually talking to when they start talking about the morals and the values of Clinton and how the legacy was so great and wonderful, and when the reality is that America is going to remember Bush as the only person with backbone to stand up against radical Islam, was against corruption and all this smoke screen with these silly little hearings and all these things that we're talking about. The bottom line is, if you look back at this stuff, remembering that Lincoln wasn't very popular, and then at the same time, you realize he's made a stand for something, and Bush is making a stand against a lot of the things that are going to corrupt this country, that could actually take this country away from us.
Rachel Maddow.
Joey, thank you for the call. I appreciate the principled idea that that a politician could be doing something right now which makes them very unpopular, but in the long run they'll be seen as brave for having done it. I look at history that way too, about taking the long view and keeping your eyes on the horizon instead of in front of your feet in terms of defining what's right and wrong in terms of leadership. I think that you're wrong that Bush will be seen as having backbone at standing up to the forces that threaten the country. And the reason I think that you're wrong about that, the reason that I disagree, is because I think that Bush never hit back at the people who attacked us on 9/11. And that the war on terrorism, the war on terror, was billed as a war on al-Qaeda. And the result, at least 5 years into it, six years into it since 9/11 now, is that we are weaker in terms of our international alliances, in terms of our moral standing in the world, in terms of the appeal of the idea of what it means to be America in the world. We are weaker in terms of our military entanglements and the ordeal that we've put our armed forces through in this ongoing, endless, pointless occupation in Iraq. We're weaker that way, and al-Qaeda is stronger. And bin Laden and Zawahiri are fine, and they still have the same terrorist sanctuary that they had in Pakistan when 9/11 happened. They still have that sanctuary. The countries that have supported, that have provided material support to al-Qaeda, either by offering sanctuary to their leaders, or in the case of Saudi Arabia supplying 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers, those countries have not paid any sort of price for the things they allowed to happen that resulted in a terrorist attack on our country. And the Muslim world is more against us than they ever have been. The appeal of Islamist terrorism is greater than it was for dispossessed kids throughout the Muslim world. We're worse off in terms of our national safety. Our enemies are stronger and we're weaker. And I think it's created almost a generational challenge for us, because not only do we still have to fight those enemies that we had to fight in 2001, but now we have to fight them from a weaker position and with less resources on our side. And that, I think, is going to be the terrible legacy of George W. Bush. In terms of domestic issues, I think the resignation of Karl Rove quitting the White House, is an appropriate time to look back on the way that domestic politics in the country, I guess, didn't proceed under George W. Bush. Whether it's the continuing crisis that we've got in terms of health care, not only affordability, but also just basic access to care in this country, the continuing crumbling of our infrastructure. I mean, we had a big infrastructure building boom in this country in the 20s and 30s, and again in the 50s and 60s. And then we were due for another one in the 80s and 90s, and Reagan conservatism meant that government was the problem instead of being part of the solution. And so we became too afraid to invest in the country again. I think that in terms of corruption and morals, the number of Republican members of Congress who are in prison from the last two Congresses, the number of White House officials who've been convicted in this lobbying slimeball scandal, Jack Abramoff, is going to speak loudly to history about the ethical legacy of this administration too.
Rachel Maddow, that last caller from Baton Rouge used the term radical Islam. What do you think of that term?
Well, I mean, I think we would benefit as a nation from being really specific when we talk about the threats that we face. I mean, you could talk about radical Christianity to describe the religious right in this country, but just using the term radical often just means that you disagree with something. I mean, I think that the idea of waging a violent battle, a terrorist battle against the West in order to get your point across is something that's more specific than your religious radicalism. I mean, fundamentalism is a form of radicalism too, but we don't problematize that the way that we problematize people who would actually turn to violence to get their point across.
New Iberia, Louisiana, Democrat, go ahead with your comment. You're on the air.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to speak to a young lady there about something, but first of all, I'd like to talk to C-SPAN. I'm very disappointed in C-SPAN for giving the Republicans disproportionate amount of airtime. These people are clearly, who think this way, are clearly in the minority in this country. Look at any poll. And to try to establish some parity on C-SPAN by giving every other phone call, I think is not serving the interest of the country.
Thank you.
And as for the young lady, I'm a very passionate Democrat. And I look at what Congress is doing right now, this Congress that I fought so passionately to get back in place. And what they're doing right now with regard to not impeaching Bush, and it's not an option, it's in their sworn oath to defend the Constitution from enemies both foreign and domestic. It's their obligation. It's not an option. And secondly, on the immigration issue, and it's called immigration, and let's get that straight. It's not immigration, it's illegal aliens. And while some people in my Democratic Party have so much compassion for these poor, unfortunate people, will look around, get down into the dirt, and look at the poor, unfortunate Americans who are being, wages being suppressed, jobs that are not available to them, and we are Americans first. I have no problem with immigrants, but let's get back to the rule of law.
Sorry, caller, thought you were finished. Rachel Maddow, a lot to play with.
Let me start with the disappointment in the Democratic Congress. I mean, as I said before, there's a lot of things in this Democratic Congress that I've been disappointed in, too. I mean, the FISA bill that was sent through right before the August recess made me almost lose my mind with anger with what the Democrats were willing to sign on to. And it wasn't a majority of Democrats, but it was enough to allow that Republican bill to go forward, and that was infuriating to me. On the impeachment issue, you know, I think there's something to watch in terms of the majority of Americans who favor impeachment proceedings right now against the president and the vice president. And that is the continuing drumbeat of hearings, what an earlier Republican caller described as those little hearings, the little smokescreen of hearings. The investigatory hearings that are happening right now are really important because what they do is they get White House officials and administration officials on the record in terms of what's actually transpired during this administration, what they could be held to account for. And those hearings, whether it's Henry Waxman or whether it's Pat Leahy or whoever is leading those charge in whichever House of Congress, those hearings, that oversight is laying the groundwork for any potential impeachment proceedings that may happen. And those aren't impeachment hearings. That's not what they're dedicated toward, but they are oriented toward finding out what's gone wrong and what's happened in this administration, so little of which we actually know anything about. So the fact-finding stuff that's happening within the Congress it's good, and it helps, and it can be accumulative in terms of the information that we find. It can be accumulative toward what may be ultimately an impeachment proceedings. So I think on impeachment, it's a process. And I do hope the Democrats get more aggressive about it, but I don't think we should disparage the oversight role that they've taken thus far. On immigration, the reasonable people disagree on immigration. I will just say that while the prospects of the worst off workers in this country and the poorest people in this country, there's nothing closer to my heart in terms of what the Democratic Party ought to be concerned about. It remains that illegal immigration has been relatively static for most of my adult life. It hasn't changed materially. And it has become a hot issue in the last 2 years because the Republican Party decided to use it as a xenophobic, racist, populist issue to try to drive wedges into the electorate, to try to turn us against each other. And you know, if you're, there's a man named Will Durst, who's a great political comedian, who I had on my show the week before last. And one of the things that Will Durst has talked about is how it's being used to turn poor people and working class people against one another and to get them to blame people who can't be voted out of office for being blamed. If you are losing your job, if you're literally losing your job to somebody who does not have but a 6th grade education and doesn't speak English, then one of the problems is maybe illegal immigration is something to blame. But you ought to also think about the fact that you've got a really horrendously bad job if that's who you're losing it to. There's bigger fish to fry. There are bigger problems at work. And if illegal immigration were solved today, working class and poor Americans would still be working class and poor and not getting a fair shake from this government.
About 15 minutes.